In the winter of 1880, near the pyramids at Saqqara, a jackal was seen slipping in and out of a crack in the stone. 2 men followed it inside. They found themselves in a burial chamber that had been sealed for more than 4,000 years, and every surface, floor to ceiling, was covered in writing that no living person was supposed to read. The most powerful Egyptologist on Earth had spent 3 decades insisting the pyramids were silent inside, bare stone, empty rooms. He would die still believing it. He was wrong. The writing was not a story. It was not a record. It was a set of commands, spoken in the voice of a dead king, aimed at the gods themselves, designed to bend the cosmos by the sheer force of language. And some of the hieroglyphs had been carved wrong on purpose. Every snake on those walls was missing its head. Every scorpion had lost its tail. The artisans who made them, working by torchlight in passages so narrow they could barely breathe, had mutilated every dangerous creature they wrote, because they believed a carved snake could come alive in the dark and sting the man they were trying to save. That man had been dead for 43 centuries, and the spells on his walls were still, in some sense, the Egyptians would have understood perfectly, working. What was found in that chamber, and in 4 more pyramids opened over the following months, would rewrite the history of human religion. It was the beginning of a tradition that lasted 3,000 years, that started as the secret technology of kings and slowly, across centuries, escaped into the hands of everyone, that asked the deepest question any civilization has ever asked. What happens to us after we die, and is there anything we can do about it? Tonight, you are going to hear the entire answer the Egyptians gave, but there is no hurry. Let the night settle around you now. Let your shoulders drop. Let the weight of the day dissolve the way sand sifts through the spaces between your fingers. You do not need to hold anything. You do not need to remember anything. The story is long, and it will carry you wherever you need to go. Imagine the desert after the sun has gone. The air is cool. A low wind moves across dunes that stretch the edge of the world. Above you, the sky is impossibly clear, and the Milky Way spills across it in a pale, luminous arc. And for a moment you understand why the ancient Egyptians believed the sky itself was a goddess. Her body arched over the earth, swallowing the sun each evening and giving birth to it again at dawn. You are standing at the edge of a necropolis, a city of the dead. The ground beneath your feet is limestone and sand, packed firm by millennia of silence. To the west, the pyramids rise against the stars, pale, almost ghostly, worn smooth by wind and time. And one of them, the smallest, is the one we are going to enter. So breathe deeply, and let us begin. The Egyptologist who had dismissed the discovery was Auguste Mariette, a Frenchman famous for his excavation of the Serapeum, a vast underground labyrinth at Saqqara. He had spent 30 years in Egypt and was certain the pyramids were dumb, bare inside, unadorned. On his deathbed, he still insisted it was true. But Mariette's own assistant, the German Egyptologist Emil Brugsch, had already slipped into the pyramids of Pepi I and Merenre in early January of 1881, confirming that the rumours were real. The walls were covered in text. And it fell to a younger man, Gaston Maspero, director of the French Institute for Oriental Archaeology in Cairo, to reveal the full scope of what had been found. Maspero was methodical, ambitious, and curious. In February of 1881, under a bright winter sun, he launched a broad investigation of the Saqqara pyramids. He entered the Pyramid of Unas on the 28th of February. Pepi II and Neferkara were opened in April, Teti in May. In less than a year, 5 of the so-called silent pyramids had spoken. Maspero wrote with barely contained excitement that the pyramids had revealed their voices at last. Inside the smallest and oldest of them, the Pyramid of Unas, he found the most pristine collection of all, by one modern count, around 283 spells, carved into white limestone walls beneath a ceiling painted to look like the night sky, deep blue and scattered with golden stars. These were the Pyramid Texts, among the oldest extended bodies of religious writing ever found anywhere on Earth. And they would change everything scholars believed about the ancient Egyptian understanding of death, the soul, and the journey that awaits beyond the border of life. Let us go inside. Let the cool air of the burial chamber settle over you. Let the torchlight flicker across the walls, catching the edges of hieroglyphs that have waited in the dark for more than 4,000 years. Do not be afraid. You are only a visitor here. The spells were not written for you. They were written for a king. and they were written with one purpose: to ensure that death was not the end. The pyramid texts are not, for the most part, prayers. That is one of the first and most important things to understand about them. Many of them are not humble petitions addressed to the gods. They are not expressions of hope or faith or longing. They are commands. They are declarations of power spoken in the voice of absolute authority, and they are directed not at the heavens, but at the very fabric of reality itself. While some utterances do take the form of hymns or offerings, the dominant tone is one of raw magical authority. When a spell within the pyramid text says, "The sky thunders, the earth quakes, for I am a magician and I possess magic," it is not a metaphor. It is not poetry. It is, in the worldview of the ancient Egyptians, a statement of literal fact. The words themselves possess power. The act of speaking them, of writing them, of carving them into stone makes them true. This is the Egyptian concept known as Heka, often translated as magic, but better understood as the fundamental creative force of the universe. Heka was not supernatural. It was the most natural thing in the world. It was the power that the Creator God used to bring the cosmos into being, and it resided in words, in names, in the precise arrangement of sounds and symbols. The priests who composed these texts understood language as a technology of transformation. Each utterance was a mechanism, a lever that could move the cosmos if spoken correctly. And so the texts were carved with obsessive precision. Every hieroglyph had to be exactly right. A single error, a single misplaced sign, could endanger the soul of the king. The artisans who carved the texts worked by torchlight in the cramped, airless corridors of the pyramid, breathing stone dust at the Umstens, labouring for months to ensure that every line was perfect. The content of the spells addressed every conceivable need the king might face after death. Some were protective, designed to ward off snakes and hostile spirits in the underworld. Some were provisioning spells, ensuring that the king would never go hungry, that bread and beer and roasted fowl would appear whenever he required them. Some were transformation spells, enabling the king to change his form, to become a falcon soaring above the earth, or a star blazing in the circumpolar sky. And some were spells of ascension, describing the king's rise from the tomb to take his place among the gods, riding the solar bark of Re across the heavens, joining Osiris in the kingdom of the dead, becoming one with the eternal cycles of the cosmos. Let those words settle around you now, like dust motes in a shaft of light. Imagine them glowing faintly on the walls around you, blue-green against white stone, columns of sacred signs stretching from floor to ceiling. Imagine the silence in which they have rested. Imagine the king who lay among them, wrapped in linen, surrounded by the only technology his people believed could defeat death. The technology of Yahweh, the language of the names of born power. To understand what the pyramid texts were trying to accomplish, you must first understand how the ancient Egyptians conceived of the human soul. And here is where things become wonderfully, almost bewilderingly complex. Because the Egyptians did not believe in a single unified soul, they believed that every person was composed of multiple spiritual elements, each with its own nature, its own function, and its own destiny after death. The most important of these was the Ka, the life force. The Ka was created at the moment of your birth, fashioned by the ram-headed god Khnum on his celestial potter's wheel. It was your double, your vital energy, the thing that made you alive rather than merely a collection of flesh and bone. When you died, your Ka did not vanish. It remained in the vicinity of your tomb, hovering near your body, still requiring sustenance. This is why the Egyptians left offerings of bread, beer, and meat at the tombs of the dead. The food was not for the corpse, it was for the Ka, which still hungered, still thirsted, still needed nourishment to persist. Then there was the Ba, the personality, often depicted as a small bird with a human head. If the Ka was your life force, the Ba was your individuality, the collection of traits and memories and experiences that made you uniquely you. After death, the Ba had the ability to leave the tomb, to fly out into the sunlight, to visit the world of the living. But it always had to return. Every night the Ba had to find its way back to the body, to reunite with the Ka, because without that reunion, the spirit could not survive. This is one of the reasons mummification was so critically important. The body had to be preserved, recognizable, intact, so that the Ba could find its way home. If the body decayed beyond recognition, if it was destroyed, If it was lost, the bar would wander without anchor, and the spirit would perish a second and final death. Beyond the car and the bar, there were other elements. The Ibi, or heart, was the seat of consciousness, of morality, of memory. It was the part of you that would be judged in the afterlife, weighed against a feather to determine whether your life had been just. The Ren was your name, a component of being so essential that to erase it was to threaten the survival of the soul itself. The Shuyet, your Shedoo, was another aspect of your being, a dark companion that travelled with you through both life and death. And then, crowning all of these, was the Akh, the glorified spirit. The Akh was not something you were born with, it was something you became. It was the radiant, immortal form that emerged when the car and the bar were successfully reunited after death, when the proper rituals had been performed, when the proper spells had been spoken, when the heart had been judged and found worthy. To become an Akh was to complete the transformation from mortal to divine. It was to become a being of light, capable of moving freely between the realms of the living and the dead, of joining the gods in the eternal cycles of the cosmos. This is what the pyramid texts were designed to achieve. Every spell, every incantation, every carefully carved hieroglyph was directed toward one ultimate goal, the transformation of the dead king into an Akh, a luminous spirit that would live forever among the stars. Picture that for a moment as you rest. The idea that death is not an ending, but a metamorphosis, that the caterpillar of your earthly life dissolves in the cocoon of the tomb, and what emerges, if all goes well, is something radiant, something that shines, something that endures. In the earliest layer of Egyptian belief, the afterlife of the king was celestial. He did not descend into an underworld. He ascended. He rose from his tomb like a hawk launched from a fist, climbing through the darkness of the burial chamber, through the stone of the pyramid, through the air and the clouds and the fading blue of the atmosphere, until he reached the stars. Not just any stars. The Egyptians distinguished between two kinds of celestial bodies. There were the stars that rose and set, that appeared and disappeared with the seasons, and there were the stars that never set, that circled endlessly around the north celestial pole, always visible, always present, never dipping below the horizon. These they called the imperishable stars, the undying ones, and they were the destination of the royal soul. The pyramid texts contain spells that describe this ascent in vivid, sometimes startling detail. The king climbs a ladder of light. He is carried upward on the smoke of incense. He rides on the back of a heron. He mounts a staircase of sunbeams. In one remarkable passage, known as the cannibal hymn, the king is described as a great hunter in the sky, capturing the gods themselves, devouring their power, absorbing their magic. It is a fierce, almost frightening passage, and scholars believe it preserves a very ancient, perhaps pre-dynastic tradition that predates the more familiar and gentle mythology of Osiris. But the celestial afterlife was only one dimension of the king's destiny. As Egyptian theology developed, a second pathway emerged, one that led not to the stars but into the company of the sun god, Re-Ate. Re was the supreme deity of the Egyptian pantheon during much of the Old Kingdom. He was the sun itself, the great golden disk that crossed the sky each day in a celestial boat, illuminating the world, driving back the darkness, sustaining all living things. But Re's journey did not end at sunset. When the sun dipped below the western horizon, the Egyptians believed it entered the Duat, the underworld, a vast and dangerous realm that lay beneath the surface of the earth. There, Re travelled through 12 hours of darkness, passing through caverns and waterways, confronting demons and monsters until, at the 12th hour, he was reborn in the east, rising again as the morning sun. The king, after death, was believed to join Re on this journey. He would board the solar bark, the great boat of the sun, and ride alongside the god through the night sky, through the underworld, participating in the eternal cycle of death and rebirth. Each night he would help Re fight against the serpent Apophis, the embodiment of chaos, who lurked in the darkness and tried to swallow the sun, and each morning he would be reborn alongside Re, rising renewed into the light. This is a beautiful image. Let it wash over you. The idea that the sun does not simply set and rise, but journeys through a world of darkness each night, battling chaos and emerging victorious each morning. And the idea that the dead king travels with it, an eternal passenger on a voyage that never ends, a cycle as reliable and as comforting as the beating of a heart. There is a third aspect to the king's afterlife, and it is perhaps the most important of all. It concerns the god Osiris, and to understand it, you must hear the story of the first death. In the beginning, according to Egyptian mythology, the gods walked upon the earth. Osiris was the firstborn son of Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky. He was a wise and benevolent king who taught humanity the arts of civilization: agriculture, law, worship, the cultivation of grain, the brewing of beer. Under his reign, Egypt flourished. The Nile ran sweet, the fields produced abundantly, the people lived in harmony. But Osiris had a brother named Seth, a god of the desert, of storms, of violence and disorder. Seth was jealous of Osiris. He coveted the throne, and so he devised a plan. The most detailed version of what happened next comes to us not from Egyptian texts directly, but from the Greek writer Plutarch, who recorded the myth nearly 2,000 years after it first took shape. No single Egyptian source tells the full story, but Plutarch's account, written around the 2nd century of the Common Era, draws together threads that appear across centuries of Egyptian tradition. According to his telling, Seth had a magnificent chest built, a beautifully ornamented sarcophagus crafted to the exact measurements of Osiris's body. At a great feast, Seth presented the chest and announced that whoever fit inside it perfectly would receive it as a gift. The guests tried one by one, but the chest had been built to the exact measurements of Osiris. When Osiris lay down inside it, Seth and his conspirators slammed the lid shut, sealed it with molten lead, and cast it into the Nile. In Plutarch's telling, Osiris drowned, trapped in the sealed chest. Other Egyptian traditions suggest Seth killed his brother by different means, perhaps by violence or dismemberment. The details shift from source to source as no single Egyptian text tells the complete story. But in every version, the essential fact remains the same. The first death had occurred. The world, which had known only life, now knew the shadow of its opposite. But the story does not end there. Isis, the wife and sister of Osiris, was the greatest magician among the gods. Consumed by grief, she searched the length of Egypt and beyond, following the current of the Nile, until she found the chest containing her husband's body. She brought it back and hid it in the marshes of the delta. But Seth discovered it. In a rage, he tore the body of Osiris into pieces and scattered them across the land of Egypt. Isis did not despair. With the help of her sister Nephthys and the jackal-headed god Anubis, she gathered the fragments, reassembled them, and wrapped them in linen, creating the first mummy. Then, using her magic, she breathed life back into Osiris, long enough for him to father a son, Horus, who would grow to avenge his father and reclaim the throne. But Osiris could not remain among the living. He had crossed the threshold of death, and no magic could fully undo that crossing. Instead, he descended into the Duat, the underworld, and there he became its king. He sat upon a throne in the Hall of Two Truths, ruling the dead with the same wisdom and justice he had once brought to the living. He became the Lord of Resurrection, the promise that death could be survived, that what was broken could be mended, that what was lost could be found. This myth became the foundation of Egyptian funerary religion. Every pharaoh upon death was identified with Osiris. The funeral rites reenacted the story. The body was mummified, as Isis had mummified Osiris. The rituals of embalming mirrored the gathering of the scattered pieces. The opening of the mouth ceremony, in which ritual tools were touched to the face of the mummy, symbolized the moment when Isis breathed life back into her husband. And the tomb itself, dark and enclosed, represented the Duat, the underworld kingdom where the king would take his place beside Osiris forever. So the pharaoh held a dual identity in death. By day he rode with Re across the sky, battling chaos, participating in the endless renewal of creation. By night he was Osiris's lord of the underworld, sovereign of the dead, the still point around which the wheel of existence turned. He was both the sun and the darkness through which the sun travelled. He was both the dying god and the reborn one. This is the mystery at the heart of the pyramid texts. Death is not annihilation, it is transformation. It is the door through which the soul must pass to reach a wider, brighter, more enduring world. For centuries the arrangement was clear. The pyramid texts belonged to the pharaoh and to the pharaoh alone. The common people of Egypt had their own beliefs about death, their own simple burials, their own modest tombs. But they did not have access to the powerful spells carved inside the royal pyramids. The technology of immortality was a royal monopoly, guarded as closely as the crown itself. This made a certain kind of sense within the Egyptian worldview. The pharaoh was not merely a human ruler. He was Horus incarnate, the living god, the bridge between the mortal world and the divine. His survival after death was not simply a personal matter, it was a cosmic necessity. If the pharaoh failed to complete his transformation, if his soul was lost, the entire order of the universe might unravel, and so every resource, every effort, every spell was dedicated to ensuring his safe passage. But then, around 2181 before the Common Era, something happened that shattered this arrangement completely. The Old Kingdom collapsed. The reasons are still debated by historians. A series of low Nile floods may have caused widespread famine. The power of the central government weakened as provincial governors grew more independent and ambitious. The long reign of Pepi II, who according to ancient sources may have sat on the throne for many decades, perhaps even the better part of a century, ended not in triumph but in entropy, as the apparatus of the state slowly crumbled around an aging king. The exact length of his reign remains a matter of scholarly discussion, but the consequence is clear. Whatever the causes, the result was catastrophic. Egypt fractured. The unified kingdom that had built the pyramids dissolved into a patchwork of competing provinces. Civil war, famine, and disorder became the new norm. This period, known as the First Intermediate Period, lasted roughly a century and a half. And during that time, something remarkable happened. The divine authority of the pharaoh, once unquestioned, was now openly challenged. If the king was a god, the people asked, why had the kingdom fallen? If his power sustained the cosmos, why were there famines? Why were there wars? The entire theological framework that had justified the royal monopoly on the afterlife began to crack. And through those cracks, the spells began to leak out. The transition happened gradually. Local governors and wealthy nobles, no longer under the control of a powerful pharaoh, began to assert their own claims to the afterlife. If the king could become Osiris, they reasoned, why not them? If spells could protect the royal soul, why not their souls? The technology of immortality, once locked inside the royal pyramids, was now available to anyone with the wealth to commission it and the scribes to write it. But there was a practical problem. These new aspirants to the afterlife did not build pyramids. They could not afford to, and even if they could, the political and religious authority to build one was no longer available. They needed a different surface on which to inscribe their spells, and so they turned to their coffins. During the Middle Kingdom, roughly 2100 to 1650 before the Common Era, a new body of funerary literature emerged. Scholars call these the Coffin Texts, and they represent one of the most important transformations in the history of human religion, the democratization of the afterlife. The Coffin Texts drew heavily on the older pyramid texts. Many of the same spells were adapted, rephrased, expanded, or abbreviated to fit their new context. But there were significant differences. The pyramid texts had been exclusively royal. The Coffin Texts were personal. They were customized for individual owners, with names and titles inserted into the appropriate places. They addressed the specific anxieties of people who were not kings, people who worried about navigating the underworld without the divine authority that the pharaoh had always possessed. And the Coffin Texts introduced something entirely new, a detailed geography of the afterlife. The pyramid texts had described the king's ascension to the stars, his journey aboard the solar bark, his identification with Osiris, but they had said relatively little about what the afterlife actually looked like. The Coffin Texts changed that. They described the field of reeds, a paradise of fertile fields, flowing water, and eternal plenty. They provided maps of the underworld, painted on the wooden surfaces of the coffin, showing rivers, paths, gates, and obstacles. They gave the dead person instructions for navigating this landscape, for speaking the right words at the right gates, for avoiding the pitfalls and dangers that lay between the tomb and the blessed fields of eternity. The coffin itself became a kind of portable pyramid. Its walls were covered with spells, its interior painted with scenes of the afterlife, its surfaces transformed into a three-dimensional guidebook for the journey of the soul. Artisans and scribes collaborated to create these remarkable objects, layering text, image, and symbol into a comprehensive system of protection and instruction. And the texts kept growing. Where the Pyramid of Unas had contained a few hundred spells, the corpus of Coffin Texts eventually expanded to 1,185 in the standard modern edition compiled by Adrian de Buck. New spells were composed to address new concerns, new threats were identified, and new defences were devised. The afterlife was becoming more complex, more detailed, more dangerous, and more accessible, all at the same time. Rest with that thought for a moment. The idea that immortality, once the exclusive property of kings, was slowly, inevitably becoming available to everyone, that the walls of the pyramid could not contain what was written on them, that the spells, like water, found their way through every crack and crevice, flowing downward, outward, into the hands of anyone willing to reach for them. Perhaps the most profound change that emerged during the era of the Coffin Texts was the introduction of moral judgment into the afterlife. In the old system, under the pyramid texts, the pharaoh's passage to eternity was more or less guaranteed. He was a god. He did not need to prove his worthiness. The spells ensured his transformation through the sheer force of magical authority. His moral character was not at issue. His divine status was his passport. But when the afterlife opened up to non-royal people, the question of who deserved immortality became suddenly and urgently relevant. If anyone could commission a set of funerary spells, what separated the just from the unjust? What prevented a wicked person from purchasing their way into paradise? The answer was judgment. The Coffin Texts, and later the Book of the Dead, introduced the concept of a moral reckoning after death. The soul would be evaluated, its deeds would be examined, its heart, the Ibi, the seat of conscience and memory, would be placed on a scale and weighed against a single feather, the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth, order and cosmic justice. This was not a simple pass or fail examination. It was an encounter with the fundamental moral fabric of the universe. Ma'at was not just a goddess. She was a principle, the principle of rightness, of balance, of the way things ought to be. She was the order that held the cosmos together, the justice that kept chaos at bay. To have a heart lighter than the feather of Ma'at was to have lived in harmony with this principle. It was to have been truthful, generous, kind. It was to have avoided cruelty, greed, deceit, and violence. It was to have lived a life that contributed to the order of the world rather than diminishing it. This shift, from a purely magical afterlife to a morally conditioned one, is one of the great turning points in the history of human thought. For the first time, the fate of the soul after death depended not on wealth or status, or the number of spells you could afford, but on the quality of the life you had lived. Immortality was now earned, not purchased, and the market for funerary magic, while still very much alive, existed within a framework that acknowledged something money could not buy: genuine goodness. Let that idea settle into you like warmth. The ancient Egyptians, thousands of years before the moral philosophies of Greece or the ethical teachings of the great world religions, arrived at this insight, that how you live matters, that the universe notices, that there is a scale somewhere, and it is waiting for your heart. Now we arrive at the heart of our story, the Book of the Dead. First, let us clear away a common misunderstanding. The Book of the Dead is not a book. It is not a single unified text with a beginning, a middle, and an end. It has no single author. It has no canonical version. It was never published in any modern sense of that word. What we call the Book of the Dead is a collection of spells, roughly 190 in total as standardized around the 7th century before the Common Era, drawn from a vast and ancient tradition of funerary literature. Different copies contain different selections of these spells. Some are lavishly illustrated, others are plain. Some were commissioned by wealthy officials who chose their spells carefully. Others were produced in workshops, pre-written on papyrus scrolls with blank spaces left for the buyer's name to be filled in later. The Egyptian name for this collection translates roughly as the chapters of going forth by day. That title tells you everything you need to know about its purpose. It was not a manual for dying. It was a manual for living, for continuing to live, for going forth from the tomb into the daylight, for moving freely between the worlds of the living and the dead, for maintaining consciousness and identity and agency after the body had failed. The tradition that would become the Book of the Dead first began to take shape during the Second Intermediate Period, around 1700 years before the Common Era. The earliest known example of its distinctive new spells appears on the coffin of Queen Mentuhotep of the 13th dynasty, where they were included alongside older texts drawn from the Pyramid Texts and Coffin Texts. By the 17th dynasty, these spells had become widespread among the royal family, courtiers and other officials. But it was during the New Kingdom, particularly from the 18th dynasty onward, around 1500 before the Common Era, that the Book of the Dead reached its mature form and became the standard funerary text for the Egyptian elite. It represented the final stage in the great democratization of the afterlife. Where the pyramid texts had been reserved for kings and the coffin texts for the wealthy elite, the Book of the Dead was available to anyone who could afford a papyrus scroll. It was still expensive, yes, but it was within the reach of a much wider segment of Egyptian society, including merchants, scribes, soldiers, and artisans. The scrolls themselves were often beautiful. They were illustrated with painted scenes known as vignettes, showing the deceased before the gods navigating the underworld, standing in the Hall of Judgment. The most famous example, the Papyrus of Ani, is a masterpiece of ancient art 78 feet long, painted in vivid colours. Its illustrations as fresh and detailed as the day they were created more than 3,000 years ago. It now resides in the British Museum in London, and if you have ever seen an image of an Egyptian soul being judged before Osiris, or a heart being weighed on a golden scale, it almost certainly came from this scroll. The spells within the Book of the Dead served an extraordinary range of purposes. Some were protective, warding off dangerous creatures in the underworld. Some were transformative, allowing the soul to take the form of a falcon, a lotus, a divine phoenix. Some were practical, ensuring that the soul would have food, water, and air. Some were navigational, providing the names and passwords needed to pass through the gates and guardhouses of the underworld. And some were deeply, movingly personal, expressing the soul's longing for the light, its determination to survive, its declaration of innocence before the tribunal of the gods. Behind every copy of the Book of the Dead was a scribe, and behind every scribe was a workshop, a tradition, a school of thought that shaped the text in distinctive ways. By the New Kingdom, the production of funerary papyri had become a significant industry. In cities like Thebes, Memphis, and Hermopolis, workshops employed teams of scribes and artists who produced copies of the Book of the Dead in varying qualities, from simple text-only versions to elaborate illustrated masterpieces. The finest scrolls were made to order. A wealthy patron might visit a workshop, select the spells they wished to include, specify the style of illustration, and commission a bespoke document tailored to their individual needs and fears. For those who could not afford such luxury, ready-made scrolls were available. These were produced in advance, written out in full, with blank spaces left where the owner's name would later be inserted. Sometimes the name was filled in carefully, sometimes it was added hastily or even incorrectly. There are surviving scrolls where the wrong name has been inserted, where gender pronouns do not match the owner, where the name appears to have been changed or corrected. These were the mass-market paperbacks of ancient Egypt, affordable, functional, and imperfect. The scribal schools also developed regional traditions. Theban workshops, located near the great temples and tombs of the Valley of the Kings, tended to produce scrolls that emphasized visual imagery and the judgment scene. Their vignettes were large, colourful, and dramatically composed. Memphis, the old capital in the north, maintained a more conservative, text-heavy tradition, closer in spirit to the older pyramid texts. Hermopolis, a centre of intellectual and theological activity, produced scrolls that were scholarly and complex, heavy with commentary and explication. These regional differences are a reminder that the Book of the Dead was not a monolithic document. It was a living tradition, constantly evolving, absorbing new ideas, shedding old ones, adapting to the changing beliefs and anxieties of Egyptian society. Each copy was, in some sense, unique. Each scribe brought their own understanding, their own emphasis, their own vision of what the afterlife looked like and what the soul would need to survive it. Of all the scenes in the Book of the Dead, none is more famous, more iconic, or more deeply significant than the weighing of the heart. It takes place in the Hall of Two Truths, a vast chamber in the underworld, where the newly dead soul stands before a tribunal of 42 divine judges, each representing a different aspect of Egyptian moral and cosmic law. Let us enter this hall together. Imagine a space of immense proportions, its ceiling lost in shadow, its walls lined with the figures of the gods, each seated in solemn silence, each wearing the feather of Ma'at upon their head. At the centre of the hall stands a great golden scale, perfectly balanced, its two pans hanging motionless in the air. Beside the scale stands Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the dead, his hand steady, his eyes unreadable. Nearby stands Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing, holding a reed pen and a palette, ready to record the result. And watching from his throne at the far end of the hall, wrapped in linen, his green skin glowing faintly in the light of unseen torches, is Osiris, the king of the dead, the one who presides over this entire proceeding. The soul steps forward. Before the weighing begins, it must make the negative confession, a declaration of innocence addressed to each of the 42 judges in turn. The exact wording varies between different copies of the Book of the Dead, and translations differ among scholars, but the substance is remarkably consistent. The soul declares, in essence, I have not committed murder, I have not stolen, I have not lied, I have not polluted the waters, I have not cursed the gods, I have not caused suffering to another, I have not been violent, I have not acted with deceit. Once the confession is complete, Anubis takes the heart. He places it gently on one pan of the scale. On the other pan rests the feather of Maat, a single white ostrich feather, impossibly light, impossibly fragile, representing the weight of truth itself. The scale moves, and the entire universe holds its breath. If the heart balances with the feather, if the two pans hang level, if the soul's life has been lived in harmony with Maat, then the verdict is favourable. Thoth records the result. Osiris nods, and the soul is declared Mar-Keru, true of voice, justified, vindicated. This is the highest honour a dead person can receive. It means that their words are true, that their life was true, that they have passed the ultimate test and been found worthy of eternity. The justified soul is then led forward, past the scale, past the throne of Osiris, into the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. But the full beauty of that place and everything the soul can do within it is something we will explore later in our journey, when the time is right. But what if the heart is heavy? What if the scale tips and the heart sinks lower than the feather? Then there is no second chance, no appeal, no mercy. Crouching beside the scale, waiting in the shadow, is a creature called Amit, the devourer. She has the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, combining the three most dangerous animals the Egyptians knew into a single terrifying form. If the heart is heavy with sins, with cruelty, with deceit, Amit eats it. And when the heart is consumed, the soul ceases to exist. Not just for a while, not temporarily, forever. This is the second death, the final and irreversible annihilation of the self. No afterlife, no memory, no trace. The soul is gone as though it had never been. The ancient Egyptians feared this second death far more than physical death. Physical death was a transition, a doorway. The second death was an abyss. It was the one thing their magic could not undo. Let your breathing slow now. Let the rhythm of your chest become like the gentle rocking of a boat on still water. Because we are about to descend into the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, and the journey we take will mirror the 12 hours of the night, each hour a separate chapter, each chapter a separate world. The Duat was not a place of simple darkness. It was a landscape, vast and varied, with its own geography, its own inhabitants, its own laws. It lay beneath the surface of the earth, and the sun god Re passed through it every night, travelling in his great solar bark from west to east, from the place of setting to the place of rising. This vision of the underworld, structured as a 12-hour nocturnal journey, is described most fully in a tradition of royal tomb texts known as the Amulets, or the Book of What is in the Underworld, which complements and enriches what we find in the Book of the Dead. Together, these texts paint a detailed picture of what the soul would encounter. The deceased travelled the same route as Re, following the path of the sun through cavern after cavern, waterway after waterway, gate after gate. In the first hours, the soul enters the western horizon, passing from the world of the living into the world of the dead. The transition is not sudden. The light fades gradually, the colours of the sunset deepening through gold and amber and crimson into the deep velvety purple of twilight. The soul is aware of leaving something behind, of crossing a boundary that cannot be uncrossed. But there is no turning back. The journey has begun. The early caverns of the Duat are relatively calm. The soul passes through regions inhabited by the blessed dead, those who have already completed their journey and been judged worthy. They sit in fields of peace, their faces turned toward the light of Re's passing bark, receiving warmth and comfort from the sun, even in the depths of the underworld. The soul sees them and takes courage. If they have made it through, perhaps it can too. But as the hours progress, the landscape grows darker, more dangerous. The rivers that flow through the Duat are not always water. Some are rivers of fire, some are rivers of shadow. The banks are lined with hostile creatures, demons and serpents and guardians who challenge the soul's right to pass. At each gate, a gatekeeper demands a password, a name, a piece of arcane knowledge that only the properly prepared soul would possess. This is where the Book of the Dead proves its worth. Without the correct spells, without the right words, the soul would be trapped, unable to proceed, left to wander in the darkness forever. The middle hours are the most treacherous. According to the various underworld texts, the soul passes through regions of blades and cutting instruments, narrow passages requiring the most careful navigation. It crosses a lake of fire, where the unprepared are burned but the justified pass safely, the flames parting for them like water. It enters the realm associated with the god Saqqara, a place of absolute darkness and silence, where even the light of Re is extinguished, and the soul must find its way by memory and by faith alone. This is the lowest point of the journey, the nadir, the moment of greatest danger and greatest doubt. In this place, the soul confronts the possibility of its own dissolution. The darkness is not merely an absence of light. It is a presence, an active force that seeks to unmake the soul, to dissolve its identity, to reduce it to formless nothing. The spells of the Book of the Dead provide protection against this dissolution, reinforcing the soul's sense of self, reminding it of its name, its history, its connections to the world above. And then, in the deepest hour of the night, comes the greatest battle. The serpent Apophis, the embodiment of chaos and nothingness, lies coiled in the path of the sun. Apophis is not a mere monster. He is the antithesis of creation, the force that existed before the world was made, and that seeks constantly to return the cosmos to its primordial state of formless void. Every night, Apophis tries to swallow Re's bark, to extinguish the sun, to end the cycle of creation forever. And every night, Re and his company of gods, including the souls of the justified dead, fight Apophis back. They bind him with chains, they cut him with knives, they drive him back into the abyss, and the sun passes on, wounded but alive, diminished but undefeated. Moving through the final hours of darkness toward the eastern horizon and the promise of dawn. This is not merely a myth, it is a theology of persistence, of resilience, of the belief that even in the deepest darkness, even at the lowest point of the night, the light endures. It is a story that the Egyptians told themselves every day, watching the sun set and believing, truly believing, that its return was not guaranteed but earned, won through struggle, maintained through vigilance. And they told it to their dead, placing the spells in their hands like weapons, like torches, like maps for a journey through the longest night the soul would ever know. Let us linger a moment longer in the underworld, for its details are rich and strange and worth exploring. The Book of the Dead describes a series of gates that the soul must pass through on its journey. Each gate is guarded by a deity, often terrifying in appearance, armed with knives or flames or serpents, and each demands that the soul demonstrate its worthiness to pass. The guardians bear names that in translation are both evocative and unsettling. Scholars have rendered them in various ways, but they include names along the lines of he who lives on snakes, she whose face is turned backward, and the swallower of sinners. The exact translations vary, but the intent is unmistakable. These are beings of fearsome power, and they do not suffer the unprepared gladly. To pass each gate, the soul must speak the guardian's name. In Egyptian magic, to know the true name of a being was to have power over it. Names were not arbitrary labels, they were intrinsic to the nature of the thing they described. To speak a guardian's name was to demonstrate that you understood its nature, that you possessed the secret knowledge required to command it, that you belonged in this place and had a right to continue your journey. The Book of the Dead provided these names, along with the correct formulas to be spoken at each gate. Without them, the soul would be turned back, or worse. Some guardians were described as having the power to decapitate the unworthy, to dismember them, to consign them to places of punishment where they would suffer endlessly. The underworld was not a forgiving place. It operated on strict rules, and the rules had to be known and followed exactly. Beyond the gates were other challenges. The soul might encounter deceptive spirits who would try to lead it astray, offering false paths that led to dead ends or traps. It might find itself in regions where time moved differently, where a moment felt like an eternity, or an eternity compressed into a single breath. It might be questioned by divine tribunals asked to account for its knowledge, its identity, its purpose. At every turn, the soul had to prove that it was who it claimed to be, that it had the right to be where it was, that it was worthy of the transformation it sought. And yet, beneath all this danger, there was a current of reassurance. The Book of the Dead existed precisely to prepare the soul for these encounters. Every threat had a counterspell, every gate had a key, every guardian had a name. The message was clear. The underworld is dangerous, but you are not defenseless. You have the words, you have the knowledge, you have the magic, and if you use them correctly, you will pass through every trial and emerge on the other side into the light, into the fields of eternity. The afterlife was populated by a rich and complex pantheon of gods. We have already met some of them at the weighing of the heart: Osiris on his throne, Anubis at the scale, Thoth with his pen. But there were others whose roles were equally vital. Isis, the great magician, the devoted wife, the grieving mother, was the protector of the dead and the patron of funerary magic. Her love for Osiris had defeated death itself, and her spells were among the most powerful in the Egyptian magical repertoire. In the Book of the Dead, she appears as a figure of comfort and guidance, helping the soul navigate the dangers of the underworld with her unmatched knowledge of Heka. Horus, the falcon-headed son of Osiris and Isis, was the avenger of his father and the protector of the living king. In the afterlife, he served as the guide who led the justified soul before the throne of Osiris, presenting it for a final approval. He was also associated with the Eye of Horus, the Wadjet, one of the most powerful protective symbols in Egyptian magic, a talisman of healing, restoration, and wholeness. Mayet herself, the goddess of truth and order, was present not as a figure but as a principle, represented by her fether on the scale. She was both abstract and personal, a cosmic force and a divine being, the invisible foundation upon which the entire edifice of Egyptian civilization rested. Without Maat, there was no justice, no order, no meaning. Without Maat, the world would return to the chaos from which it was born. And beyond these great gods, there were dozens, hundreds of lesser deities, spirits, demons, and guardians, each with their own role, their own name, their own place in the vast and intricate machinery of the Egyptian afterlife. The underworld was not a lonely place. It was crowded, busy, teeming with divine life, and the soul who navigated it successfully did so, not in isolation, but in the company of gods who had walked this path since the beginning of time. Before the soul could begin its journey through the underworld, there was a crucial ritual that had to be performed at the tomb itself. It was called the opening of the mouth, and it was one of the most important and elaborate ceremonies in the entire Egyptian funerary tradition. The principle behind the ritual was straightforward. The mummy, wrapped in linen, sealed in its coffin, was inert. Its eyes could not see, its mouth could not speak, its ears could not hear. And if the soul were to survive in the afterlife, if it were to eat, drink, breathe, and speak the spells that would protect it, these senses had to be restored. The opening of the mouth ceremony accomplished this symbolically, using a set of ritual tools that were touched to the face of the mummy or the funerary statue in a precise sequence. The Sem priest, typically identifiable by the leopard skin draped over his shoulders, performed the ceremony. He used an adze, a small blade-like ritual tool to touch the mouth, the eyes, the ears, and the nose of the deceased. As he did so, he recited the appropriate spells, declaring that the mouth was opened, the eyes were opened, the ears were opened, that the deceased could now breathe, could now Subtitu speak, could now see the light of the sun and hear the voices of the gods. The ceremony was extraordinarily detailed, involving multiple stages, multiple officiants, and multiple repetitions. Offerings of food and drink were presented, incense was burned, prayers were chanted, the entire community of the living participated in the reawakening of the dead, bridging the gap between this world and the next through ritual, through language, through the shared belief that death was not a wall but a threshold. And then, with the senses restored, with the spells in place, with the body preserved and the coffin sealed, the soul was ready to cross the river, ready to enter the duat, ready to face the gods and the guardians and the great golden scale, ready to begin the longest, most important journey it would ever take. Let us now imagine the end of the journey. The soul has passed through all the gates. It has spoken all the passwords. It has survived the regions of blades and fire and the dark realm of Saqqara. It has fought alongside Re against the serpent Apophis. It has stood before the 42 judges and made its confession. it has placed its heart on the scale and watched, breathless, as the pans balanced perfectly, as Thoth recorded the verdict, as Osiris nodded, as the word Makeru was spoken. And now, at last, it arrives at the field of reeds. This was the Egyptian paradise, and it was different from the heavens of many other cultures in one crucial respect. It was not otherworldly. It did not transcend earthly life. It mirrored it. The field of reeds was, in essence, a perfect version of Egypt. The Nile flowed through it, clear and abundant. The fields were lush and green, stretching to horizons that never ended. The sun shone warmly but not harshly. The air was cool and fragrant with lotus blossoms. Birds sang in the papyrus thickets. Fish moved through the shallows in flashes of silver. The justified soul found here everything it had loved in life, restored and perfected. Its home was waiting, exactly as it remembered it, but somehow more beautiful, more substantial, more real than it had ever been. The garden was in bloom, the granary was full, the beer jars were freshly sealed, and the people it loved were there too, whole and healthy and radiant, waiting at the door as they had always waited, as though no separation had ever occurred. This was the genius of the Egyptian vision of paradise. It did not demand that you become something entirely new. It did not require you to leave behind everything you had known and loved. Instead, it promised that the best of your earthly life would endure, that the joys you had experienced were not fleeting but permanent, that the world you had built around yourself, the relationships, the pleasures, the simple daily satisfactions, were not lost when you died, but preserved eternally in a realm of perfect and unending peace. And there was more. The justified soul, now an Akh, possessed abilities that no living person could claim. It could take any form it wished. It could fly above the fields as a falcon. It could swim beneath the waters as a fish. It could become a shaft of light, travelling between the realms of the living and the dead. It could visit its descendants in dreams, offering guidance and comfort. It could participate in the great cosmic cycles, riding with Rizal Ray across the sky by day, resting with Osiris in the underworld by night. It was not merely alive, it was alive forever, in a fullness and a freedom that the mortal world could never offer. We have spoken at length about the spiritual journey of the soul, but we should not overlook the extraordinary physical preparations that made that journey possible. Mummification was not merely a burial custom, it was a sacred technology, developed over thousands of years, refined with obsessive care, and practiced with a precision that still astonishes modern scientists. The process took approximately 70 days. It began with the washing of the body in water from the Nile, symbolizing purification and the primordial waters of creation. Then the internal organs were removed. The brain was extracted through the nose using long, hooked instruments, a delicate and time-consuming procedure. The lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines were removed through an incision in the left side of the abdomen, each organ preserved separately and placed in a canopic jar guarded by one of the 4 sons of Horus. The heart, however, was left in place. The Egyptians believed the heart was the seat of intelligence, personality, and moral consciousness. It was the organ that would be weighed in the Hall of Two Truths. To remove it would be to remove the very essence of the person. After the organs were removed, the body was packed and covered with natron, a naturally occurring salt found along the shores of dry lake beds in the Egyptian desert. The natron absorbed moisture from the tissues, desiccating the body and preventing decomposition. The body remained in natron for approximately 40 days, during which time it lost much of its weight and volume, becoming dry, hard, and remarkably well preserved. Once the drying was complete, the body was anointed with oils and resins, packed with linen and sawdust to restore its shape, and wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen bandage. Amulets were placed within the wrappings at specific locations, each one charged with a particular protective spell. The heart scarab, a carved stone beetle inscribed with spells from the Book of the Dead, was placed over the heart to prevent it from testifying against its owner during the judgment. The Wadjet eye, the eye of Horus, was placed over the incision in the abdomen. Finger and toe caps of gold were sometimes added. The entire process was a ritual act, performed by priests who chanted the appropriate spells at every stage, transforming the clinical procedure into a sacred ceremony that reenacted the mythological embalming of Osiris by Isis and Anubis. The resulting mummy was not merely a preserved corpse, it was a vessel prepared for the return of the Ba, a home for the Ka, a physical anchor for the spiritual elements of the soul. Without it, the entire journey through the underworld would have been impossible. The body was the foundation upon which the architecture of immortality was built. Among the most fascinating spells in the Book of the Dead are those that describe the transformation of the soul into other forms. These are not metaphors. They are operational instructions, magical procedures that the soul is expected to perform, changing its shape as a craftsman changes the shape of clay. Spell 77 enables the soul to become a golden falcon. The falcon was associated with Horus, the god of the sky, and to take its form was to claim a share of divine power, to soar above the underworld, to see the landscape from a perspective that no earthbound being could achieve. The spell declares, "I have risen, I have gathered myself together, I have become whole, I have fashioned my eyes, I have gathered my limbs. I fly up as a golden falcon." Spell 81 transforms the soul into a lotus flower. The lotus was a symbol of creation and rebirth in Egyptian mythology, because it closes at night and sinks below the water, only to rise again and open at dawn. To become a lotus was to embody the cycle of death and renewal, to become the flower that emerges from the dark waters of chaos into the light of a new day. Other spells allowed the soul to become a divine phoenix, a heron, a swallow, a serpent of great power, or even a crocodile. Each transformation carried specific symbolic meaning and practical advantages. The swallow could travel quickly and unobtrusively. The serpent could pass through narrow spaces and ward off other serpents. The phoenix, known to the Egyptians as the Bennu bird, was associated with the primordial mound of creation and the daily rebirth of the sun. These spells reflect a worldview in which identity was not fixed but fluid. The soul was not locked into a single form. It could become anything it needed to be, adapting to the challenges of the underworld with the flexibility and resourcefulness that the Egyptians valued so highly. And this fluidity extended into the afterlife itself. The justified soul in the field of reeds could change its form at will, shifting between shapes as easily as a dreamer shifts between dreams. Perhaps that is a comforting thought to carry with you as you drift deeper towards sleep. The idea that you are not confined to a single shape, that somewhere in some ancient and enduring tradition it was believed that the soul is infinitely adaptable, infinitely creative, capable of becoming a bird, a flower, a star, a shaft of light moving across the surface of still water. No discussion of the Book of the Dead would be complete without spending time with its most celebrated example, the Papyrus of Ani. Ani was a royal scribe who lived in Thebes during the 19th dynasty, around 1250 years before the Common Era. He held the titles of royal scribe, reckoner of the divine offerings of all the gods, and overseer of the granaries of the lords of Abydos, positions that placed him at the intersection of the temple economy and the bureaucratic machinery of the Egyptian state. He was wealthy, educated, and deeply devoted to the religious traditions of his time. And when he prepared for death, he commissioned a scroll that would become the single most important surviving example of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The Papyrus of Ani is 78 feet long and contains beautifully illustrated versions of dozens of spells. Its vignettes are masterpieces of ancient art rendered in rich colours that have survived 3 millennia with astonishing vividness. The reds, greens, yellows, and blues are as fresh as the day they were painted, preserved by the dry heat of the Theban desert. The most famous scene in the papyrus is the one you have already visited tonight, the weighing of the heart, painted here with a vividness that no other surviving copy can match. What makes the Papyrus of Ani extraordinary, though, is not any single scene but the cumulative effect of the whole. The sheer slaughter, the care lavished on every figure and every sign, the sense that this was not a mass-produced commodity but a personal object made by human hands for a man who believed, with absolute conviction, that his eternity depended on it. The Papyrus of Ani was discovered by Egyptian antiquities dealers in Luxor and acquired in 1888 by E.A. Wallace Budge on behalf of the British Museum, where it remains today. It was the work of a skilled but not infallible scribe. There are minor errors in the text, places where the wrong spell has been included, or where the wording has been slightly garbled. These imperfections make the scroll feel more human, more real. It is not the work of a god. It is the work of a man, a craftsman, doing his best with ink and papyrus and paint to capture something infinite. Woven throughout the wrappings of a mummy, placed in the folds of linen, pressed against the skin of the preserved body, were dozens of small objects charged with protective magic. These were amulets, and they formed a critical part of the Book of the Dead's system of defense. Each amulet served a specific purpose and was linked to specific spells in the Book of the Dead. The Djed pillar, a column-shaped amulet representing the backbone of Osiris, ensured the stability and strength of the deceased. The Tiet knot, sometimes called the Knot of Isis, provided the protection of the great goddess. The Wadjet eye, the Eye of Horus, offered healing and restoration. The heart scarab, as we have seen, protected the heart during the judgment. These were not mere decorations or tokens of faith. In the Egyptian world view, they were functional tools, as real and as effective as any medicine or weapon. The spells inscribed on them activated their power, and the rituals performed during their placement consecrated them for their purpose. A properly prepared amulet was a piece of working magic, a fragment of the cosmic order embedded in linen and stone and gold, standing guard over the body of the dead while the soul travelled through the underworld. The Book of the Dead itself contained detailed instructions for the creation and placement of these amulets. Spell 155, for example, describes the Djed pillar amulet. It specifies the material from which it should be made, the spell that should be inscribed on it, and the exact position in which it should be placed on the mummy. Spell 156 does the same for the Tiet knot. Spell 27 protects the heart from being taken away in the underworld. Spell 29 ensures that the heart will not be separated from the body. The care and precision with which these instructions were followed reflects the seriousness with which the Egyptians took their funerary preparations. Every detail mattered. Every amulet had to be correct. Every spell had to be accurate. The margin for error was zero because the stakes were infinite. An improperly placed amulet, a misspelled incantation, a forgotten ritual could compromise the entire enterprise of immortality. One of the most distinctive features of the Egyptian worldview was its understanding of time. The Egyptians did not think of time as a straight line, moving from past to future, never returning. They understood time as cyclical, as an eternal pattern of repetition and renewal, modelled on the great natural cycles they observed around them every day. The sun rose and set, the Nile flooded and receded, the stars wheeled through the sky in the same patterns, year after year, century after century. The seasons turned, seeds were planted, grew, were harvested, and were planted again. Birth followed, death followed birth. Nothing was truly lost, nothing was truly new. Everything had happened before, and everything would happen again. This cyclical understanding of time permeated their religion. The journey of the sun through the underworld was not a one-time event, but a nightly occurrence, a pattern, as regular and as reliable as breathing. The death and resurrection of Osiris was not a historical event, but an eternal truth happening always, everywhere, at every moment. The soul's passage through the Duat was not a unique adventure, but a repetition of a journey that had been made billions of times before by billions of souls, each one tracing the same path through the same darkness toward the same dawn. This may be one of the most comforting aspects of the Egyptian vision of the afterlife. You are not alone on this journey. You are not a pioneer venturing into unknown territory. You are a traveller on a well-worn path, following in the footsteps of all who have gone before you. The gods have walked this path, the kings have walked it, your parents and their parents and their parents before them have walked it, and they are waiting for you at the end of the road, in the fields of eternity, with open arms and familiar smiles. The Book of the Dead was not an isolated phenomenon. Its influence extended far beyond the borders of Egypt and far beyond the centuries in which it was actively used. The tradition of funerary texts, which began with the pyramid texts around 2400 years before the Common Era, continued in various forms until the Roman period, spanning more than 2,000 years of continuous development. The last known copies of the Book of the Dead were likely produced around the 1st century before the Common Era, though some scholars suggest the tradition may have lingered as late as the 2nd century of the Common Era in certain contexts. By that time, the old religion was fading, replaced by Christianity and other belief systems. But the ideas it contained did not disappear. They were absorbed, transformed, and transmitted through the channels of culture and mythology into traditions that survive to this day. The concept of a moral judgment after death, of a divine tribunal weighing the deeds of the deceased, appears in many later religious traditions. The idea of a paradise that mirrors the best of earthly life, a garden of abundance and peace, echoes through the literature of multiple faiths. The image of the soul as a bird free to fly between worlds is found in cultures across the globe. The notion that words have power, that the right incantation can alter reality, is the foundation of magical traditions from medieval Europe to modern spiritual practice. The Egyptians may not have invented these ideas. Some of them may be even older, reaching back into the pre-dynastic period, into the oral traditions of peoples who left no written record. But the Egyptians were the first to write them down, to carve them in stone, to paint them on papyrus, to preserve them in tombs that would endure for millennia. And in doing so, they ensured that these ideas would survive, would be rediscovered, would speak to us across the vast gulf of time. When the Rosetta Stone was deciphered in 1822, and the hieroglyphs began to yield their secrets, the Book of the Dead was among the first and most exciting texts to be translated. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, modern people could read the words that the ancient Egyptians had spoken to their dead. And those words, strange as they sometimes are, alien as the worldview that produced them may seem, contained something recognizably human. They express the same fears and hopes that we carry with us today: the fear of death, the hope of survival, the longing for the people we have loved and lost, the desire to believe that this life, this brief and beautiful flicker of consciousness, is not all there is. To truly understand the Egyptian Book of the Dead, you must understand the Nile. It was the artery of Egyptian civilization, the source of all life, the organizing principle around which everything in Egypt was built. The entire rhythm of Egyptian existence was dictated by its moods. Each year, beginning in June, the Nile would rise. Fed by monsoon rains far to the south in the Ethiopian highlands, the river would swell slowly at first, then with gathering force until by August or September, it had overflowed its banks and flooded the entire valley. The floodwaters deposited a rich layer of black silt across the fields, renewing the soil, restoring its fertility, ensuring another year of abundant harvests. When the waters receded, the farmers planted their crops in the newly enriched earth, and the cycle began again. The Egyptians saw in this annual flood a mirror of the cosmic cycle. The land died each year, submerged beneath the waters, and was reborn when the waters withdrew. Just as the sun died each evening and was reborn each morning, just as Osiris died and was resurrected. The pattern was everywhere: death and renewal, ending and beginning, the eternal return of life from the embrace of death. The funerary geography of Egypt was organized around the Nile as well. The living cities were built on the east bank, the side of the rising sun, the side of life and light. The tombs and cemeteries were on the west bank, the side of the setting sun, the side of death and the underworld. To cross the Nile from east to west was, symbolically, to cross from life into death, and the ferrymen who carried the dead across the river were the earthly reflections of the divine ferryman who carried the soul across Lily Lake in the afterlife. Everything in Egypt was connected. The river, the sun, the gods, the dead, the living, the stars, the seasons, the floods. They were all part of a single vast interconnected system, and the Book of the Dead was one of the tools that the Egyptians used to navigate that system, to maintain their place within it, to ensure that the cycle continued unbroken, from generation to generation, from life to death to life again. There is one more aspect of the Egyptian magical worldview that deserves attention as we approach the end of our journey, and it concerns the extraordinary power that the Egyptians attributed to names. In the Egyptian understanding, a name was not a label, it was a component of being. Your name was as much a part of you as your heart or your shadow. To know someone's true name was to have a measure of power over them. To speak someone's name was to keep them alive. To erase someone's name was to destroy them. This belief permeated every level of Egyptian society. Pharaohs carved their names on monuments in enormous hieroglyphs, ensuring that their names would endure for millennia. The practice known as damnatio memoriae, the deliberate erasure of a person's name from all records and monuments, was among the most severe punishments imaginable, worse than death, because it threatened the survival of the soul. When, decades into his sole reign, Thutmose III ordered the name and image of Hatshepsut removed from many of her monuments, scholars have debated exactly why. Some believe it was politically motivated, others suggest it may have had deeper theological implications. Whatever the reason, in the Egyptian worldview, such erasure carried the terrifying possibility of spiritual annihilation. In the Book of the Dead, names play a critical role. The soul must know the names of the gates and their guardians. It must know the names of the rivers and the paths of the underworld. It must know the names of the gods, and it must know its own name, must hold it firmly in memory, must not allow it to be forgotten or stolen or confused. There are spells specifically designed to protect the name, to ensure that it is remembered, to prevent the forces of the underworld from taking it away. One of the most moving aspects of Egyptian funerary culture was the practice of saying the name of the dead. Visitors to a tomb were often asked, through inscriptions on the walls, to speak the name of the tomb's owner aloud. This was not a mere courtesy. It was a vital act of spiritual maintenance. By speaking the name, the visitor was keeping the soul alive, feeding it with the energy of recognition, ensuring that it continued to exist in the memories of the living. And when the inscriptions on the tomb begged future visitors to say the name, they were expressing a deep and universal human need, the need to be remembered, to persist in the minds of others, to not be forgotten. This practice continued for thousands of years. Even today, when tourists visit the tombs of ancient Egypt and read the names inscribed on the walls, they are, in a sense, performing the same ritual that the Egyptians intended. They are speaking the names of the dead. They are keeping alive, for one more moment, souls that have been waiting in the darkness for someone to remember them. Let us return for a moment to the Hall of Two Truths, and let us listen more closely to the words the soul must speak. The Negative Confession is one of the most extraordinary documents in all of ancient literature, not because of its literary beauty, though it possesses a stark and rhythmic power, but because of what it reveals about the moral universe of the ancient Egyptians. It is in effect a portrait of the ideal life drawn in negative, describing not what a person should have done, but what they should not have done. The confession is addressed to 42 gods, one declaration for each, and the declarations cover an astonishing range of human behaviour, from the gravest crimes to the subtlest failures of character. The soul declares that it has not committed murder, it has not stolen, it has not committed fraud or perjury, it has not tampered with the grain measure or the water channel. These are the obvious prohibitions, the foundational rules of any functioning society, but the list goes further, much further. The soul declares that it has not been angry without just cause, it has not eavesdropped, it has not been impatient, it has not puffed up with pride, it has not sulked or thrown tantrums, it has not raised its voice unnecessarily. These are not crimes in any legal sense, they are failures of temperament, lapses of grace, the small daily sins of selfishness and irritation that we all commit and rarely think twice about. The soul also declares that it has not polluted the river, it has not trapped the birds of the marshes, it has not driven cattle from their pastures, it has not dammed the water in its season. These ecological prohibitions are remarkable. They suggest that the Egyptians understood themselves as stewards of the natural world, responsible not only for their own behaviour but for the health and balance of the environment around them. To pollute the Nile was not just a practical offence, it was a sin against Ma'at, a violation of the cosmic order. And there are declarations that touch on the inner life, on the landscape of the heart and mind. The soul declares that it has not turned its back on truth. It has not multiplied words in speaking. It has not been the cause of another person's tears. It has not worked to make another person miserable. It has not wished evil upon another. These are not matters of action, but of intention, of the quality of attention and care that a person brings to their relationships and their community. Taken together, the 42 declarations paint a picture of a life lived with extraordinary mindfulness. Not a life of asceticism or withdrawal from the world, but a life of engagement, of participation, of active kindness and careful attention. The ideal Egyptian was not someone who avoided the world, but someone who moved through it gently, leaving it better than they found it, causing no unnecessary harm, contributing to the order and beauty of creation. There is something deeply moving about this vision. It asks so much and so little at the same time. It does not demand heroism or self-sacrifice. It does not require great deeds or grand gestures. It simply asks that you be kind, that you be honest, that you pay attention, that you do not cause suffering where suffering is not necessary, that you leave the water clean and the birds free and the grain measure honest and the hearts of those around you untroubled. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that has always been enough. Let us step out of the underworld now and return to the surface, to the world of the living, and watch as a funeral procession makes its way through the streets of ancient Thebes. It is early morning. The sun is just rising over the eastern hills, painting the sandstone temples in shades of gold and amber. A crowd has gathered along the road that leads from the city to the river. They are dressed in white linen. Some of the women have rubbed ash into their hair and are weeping openly, their cries rising and falling in a rhythm that is both spontaneous and ritualized. A public expression of grief that serves as both a release and a performance, a way of honoring the dead by showing the depth of the community's loss. At the centre of the procession is the coffin, mounted on a sledge drawn by oxen. The coffin is painted in vivid colours, its surface covered with images of the gods, with scenes from the Book of the Dead, with the face of the deceased rendered in idealised, serene beauty. Behind the coffin come servants carrying the goods that will accompany the dead person into the tomb: jars of beer and wine, loaves of bread, haunches of beef, baskets of figs and dates, rolls of linen, pieces of jewellery, game boards, cosmetic jars, sandals, headrests, and most importantly, the papyrus scroll of the Book of the Dead, rolled tight and bound with a cord. The procession reaches the riverbank where boats are waiting. The coffin and the mourners are loaded aboard, and the boats push off from the eastern shore, crossing the Nile toward the west, toward the land of the dead. The river is calm, the oars dip and rise, the mourners sing, their voices carrying across the water, mingling with the cries of ibirs and herons along the banks. On the western shore, the procession reforms and climbs the winding path into the hills, toward the tombs that honeycomb the limestone cliffs. The sun is higher now, the heat beginning to build. The air smells of dust and incense and the faint, sweet, unmistakable scent of the embalming oils that cling to the coffin. At the tomb entrance, the Sem priest performs the opening of the mouth, the ritual you heard described earlier tonight, and the senses of the dead are restored. The family watches in solemn silence. The spells are spoken, the soul is freed, and then the coffin is carried down into the darkness of the tomb. The goods are arranged around it. The canopic jars are placed in their niche. The papyrus is tucked beside the body within reach, ready for the moment when the soul will need its spells. The priests withdraw, the mourners file out, the tomb is sealed, and in the darkness, in the silence, the journey begins. The coffin that held the mummy was not merely a container, it was a cosmos in miniature, a carefully designed microcosm that represented the entire Egyptian universe. The interior of the coffin was painted to represent the body of the sky goddess Nut. She arched across the ceiling of the lid, her body studded with stars, her arms extended to embrace the deceased. The coffin floor sometimes depicted Geb, the Earthya, or the western horizon, the place where the sun entered the underworld. The sides of the coffin were covered with spells and images, protective deities standing guard, the 4 sons of Horus watching over the organs, the eyes of Horus painted on the eastern side so the deceased could look out toward the rising sun. During the Middle Kingdom, when the Coffin Texts were at the height of their use, the interior surfaces of coffins became elaborate canvases for maps of the afterlife. These maps showed the paths through the underworld, the rivers and lakes, the gates and guardians, the regions of fire and darkness. They were functional documents meant to be consulted by the soul as it navigated the Duat, and they represented some of the earliest known cartographic traditions in human history. The outside of the coffin was equally significant. The face painted on the lid was not a portrait in the modern sense, but an idealized image, representing the deceased in their perfected, eternal form. The eyes were often inlaid with stone or glass, giving them a startling lifelike quality. The body was painted with a broad collar, a symbol of divine status, and the hands were sometimes carved in relief crossed over the chest in the pose of Osiris. Some coffins were nested, one inside another, like the layers of an onion. A wealthy individual might have 2 or even 3 coffins, each one fitting snugly inside the next, each layer adding another dimension of protection and symbolism. The innermost coffin closest to the body was the most sacred. The outermost was the most decorative, the face the world would see before the tomb was sealed. And the coffin was not the end. The coffins were placed inside a stone sarcophagus, which was placed inside the burial chamber, which was sealed behind doors of stone, which was located at the end of corridors and passageways that penetrated deep into the rock. Each layer, from the linen wrappings on the mummy to the rock face of the tomb itself, represented another boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead, another layer of protection for the soul on its journey. Think of it as falling asleep inside a series of embraces, each one larger and more encompassing than the last. The linen wraps close around you. The coffin holds you. The sarcophagus encloses the coffin. The tomb encloses the sarcophagus. The earth encloses the tomb. And the sky, the great body of Nut, arches over everything, her stars looking down, her arms encircling the world, holding the living and the dead alike in the infinite darkness of her embrace. Among the most charming objects found in Egyptian tombs are the Shabti figures. These are small staccatis, usually made of faience, wood or stone, depicting mummiform figures holding agricultural tools, hoes, picks, seed baskets. They were placed in the tomb in large numbers, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds. When the tomb of Pharaoh Seti I was opened in the Valley of the Kings, around 700 Shabti figures were recovered, and some estimates suggest he may have originally had over 1,000, making his one of the largest collections ever found for a New Kingdom ruler. Their purpose was wonderfully practical. The Egyptians believed that in the afterlife, as in life, there would be work to do. The fields of the Field of Reeds needed to be ploughed, sown, irrigated, and harvested. Canals needed to be dug and maintained, and the gods, like the pharaohs they resembled, might summon the deceased for compulsory labour at any time. The Shabti figures were the solution. They were magical servants, activated by a spell inscribed on their bodies, usually chapter 6 of the Book of the Dead. When the deceased was called to labour in the afterlife, the Shabti would answer in their place, stepping forward and saying, "Here I am," and performing the required work while the soul of the deceased rested in comfort. The inscription on a typical Shabti reads something like, "O Shabti, if the deceased is called upon to do any work that is to be done in the realm of the dead, to cultivate the fields, to irrigate the riverbanks, to transport sand from the east to the west, then you shall say, 'Here I am, I shall do it.'" There is something deeply human about this arrangement. The Egyptians loved life. They enjoyed their pleasures, their feasts, their gardens, their families. They did not look forward to death, and they certainly did not look forward to an eternity of manual labour. The Shabti figures were a way of ensuring that paradise was truly paradisiacal, that the promised rest was genuine, that the endless fields of the afterlife would not become an endless burden. Some wealthy Egyptians commissioned Shabti figures of extraordinary quality, carved from precious materials, painted in fine detail, individualized with the owner's name and titles. Others had simple mass-produced figures, barely shaped, with the spell hastily scratched into the surface. But whether fine or crude, every Shabti served the same purpose: to stand in for the dead, to work in their place to ensure that the afterlife was a place of rest and not of toil. It is worth pausing to note that the democratization of the afterlife extended over time to women as well as men. In the earliest period, the pyramid texts were reserved for the pharaoh, who was always male, but even during the Old Kingdom, a few queens received pyramid texts of their own, notably Queen Neith, Queen Iput, and Queen Wejebten, who had their pyramids inscribed during the 6th dynasty. During the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom, women were increasingly included in the funerary tradition. Wealthy women commissioned their own coffins and their own copies of the Book of the Dead. They were depicted in the judgment scene, standing before Osiris, making their own negative confessions, having their own hearts weighed on the scale. The papyrus might be adjusted for the gender of the owner, with the appropriate pronouns and titles changed, though this was not always done carefully, and some surviving scrolls contain awkward mismatches between male text and female owners. Among the most notable female owners of a Book of the Dead is Anhé, a priestess enchantress of Amun who lived around the 21st dynasty. Her papyrus, now in the British Museum, is beautifully illustrated and contains a full range of spells for her protection and transformation in the afterlife. It presents her as fully capable of navigating the underworld on her own terms, speaking the spells, confronting the guardians, passing the judgment. Isis herself, the greatest goddess of the Egyptian pantheon, provided the model for women's participation in the afterlife. She was the wife who reassembled her husband's broken body. She was the mother who raised a son to avenge his father. She was the magician whose spells could raise the dead. Her power was not secondary or derivative. It was primary from fundamental, the force that held the mythology together. And the women who carried copies of the Book of the Dead into their tombs were claiming a share of that power for themselves. Before we leave the pyramid text behind entirely, there is one more passage that deserves attention, not because it is typical, but because it is extraordinary. It is called the Cannibal Hymn, and it is found only in the pyramids of Unas and Teti, making it one of the oldest and rarest of all Egyptian funerary texts. The cannibal hymn describes the dead king not as a supplicant before the gods, but as a predator among them. He rises into the sky as a great hunter. He captures the gods, he binds them, he slaughters them, he cooks their flesh in cauldrons, and he eats them, absorbing their power, their magic, their divine essence into himself. The text distinguishes between the great gods, the medium gods, and the small gods, each consumed at different meals, suggesting a systematic devouring of the entire divine hierarchy. He becomes the mightiest of all world beings, swollen with the power of every deity he has consumed. This is a shocking passage, and scholars have debated its meaning for more than a century. Some believe it preserves a very ancient pre-dynastic tradition, possibly predating the worship of Osiris, in which the king's divinity was conceived in terms of raw, predatory power rather than moral authority. Others see it as a metaphorical description of the king absorbing the attributes of the gods, becoming all-powerful through identification with the divine rather than through literal consumption. Whatever its origins, the cannibal hymn is a reminder that the Egyptian funerary tradition was not a monolithic system. It was a living, evolving body of belief, layered with traditions of different ages and different sensibilities. The gentle, moralistic afterlife of the Book of the Dead, with its weighing of the heart and its paradise of green fields, was the end product of a long development that began with something much older, much stranger, much more fierce. And there is something almost comforting in the ferocity of the cannibal hymn. It speaks to a primal confidence, an absolute refusal to be diminished by death. The king does not beg for entry into the afterlife, he seizes it. He does not ask the gods for favour, he takes their power for himself. There is a wild, untamable energy in these words, a defiance that rings across the millennia like a shout in an empty chamber. The Book of the Dead did not die suddenly. It faded slowly, like the last light of a long Egyptian sunset, its colours deepening and darkening over centuries before finally dissolving into the night. During the late period, from roughly the 7th century to the 4th century before the Common Era, the Book of the Dead continued to be produced, but it was changing. New spells were added, old ones were revised or dropped. The scroll format remained popular, but the texts also appeared on tomb walls, on coffins, on mummy wrappings, on linen shrouds, and on papyrus fragments tucked between the layers of bandage that encased the mummy. The tradition was dispersing, spreading into new formats and new contexts, adapting to a world that was itself changing rapidly. The conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great in 332 before the Common Era brought Greek culture, Greek language, and Greek ideas into the Nile Valley. The Ptolemaic dynasty that followed, Greek-speaking rulers who adopted Egyptian customs to legitimize their power, continued to patronize the old temples and the old traditions. Copies of the Book of the Dead were still produced, mummies were still prepared, the gods were still worshipped. But the cultural centre of gravity was shifting and the old certainties were beginning to erode. Under Roman rule, which began with the death of Cleopatra in 30 before the Common Era, the changes accelerated. The temples were maintained but increasingly neglected. The priesthood, once the most powerful class in Egyptian society, lost its influence. The scribes who had produced the funerary papyri found fewer and fewer patrons. The knowledge of hieroglyphic writing, which had sustained the tradition for 3,000 years, began to fade. Most scholars place the last use of the Book of the Dead around the 1st century before the Common Era, though it is possible that some copies were produced as late as the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era. The evidence from this final period is thin and poorly documented. What is clear is that by that time Christianity was spreading rapidly through Egypt, bringing with it a fundamentally different vision of the afterlife. The old gods retreated, the temples fell silent, the scribes put down their pens, and the Book of the Dead, which had guided the souls of Egyptians for more than 1,000 years, passed into the darkness of the forgotten. But it was not truly forgotten. It was waiting in the tombs and the dry sands and the sealed chambers of the Nile Valley, preserved by the same desert air that preserved the mummies it accompanied. And when, nearly 2 millennia later, European explorers and archaeologists began to open those tombs and unroll those scrolls, the Book of the Dead spoke again, its words as clear and as powerful as the day they were written. What are we to make of all this, here at the edge of sleep, 4,000 years removed from the artisans who carved the first spells into the walls of the Pyramid of Unas? We might say that the ancient Egyptians were wrong, that there is no underworld, that there is no Hall of Two Truths, that the heart is not weighed on a golden scale, that the field of reeds does not exist, and that the souls of the dead do not ride with the sun god through 12 hours of darkness, battling the serpent of chaos, emerging renewed at dawn. We might say all of that, and we might be right. But we would be missing something. Because the Book of the Dead is not merely a set of factual claims about the afterlife. It is something deeper and more enduring. It is a sustained collective multi-generational meditation on the meaning of death and the possibility of transcendence. It is the work of a civilization that looked at death squarely, without flinching, and refused to accept that it was the final word. The Egyptians did not deny death. They acknowledged it fully. They embalmed their dead. They wrapped them in linen. They sealed them in stone. They did not pretend that the body would not decay without intervention, or that the soul would automatically survive without preparation. They were in many ways the most clear-eyed realists about death that the ancient world produced. But they also believed, with a conviction that burns through every spell and every vignette and every carved hieroglyph, that death could be navigated, that it was not an abyss, but a landscape, not an ending but a passage, not a wall but a door, and that they spent 3,000 years developing the most elaborate, most detailed, most beautiful set of instructions ever created for walking through that door and finding on the other side something worth arriving at. That is not superstition. That is a profound act of imaginative courage. It is the work of a people who refuse to let the darkness have the last word. And whether or not we share their specific beliefs, whether or not we think the bar really did fly out of the tomb each morning like a bird with a human face, there is something in their vision that speaks to us still, something that whispers in the quiet of the night that the love we feel for the people we have lost is not wasted, that the lives we have lived are not meaningless, that there is something in us, call it a soul or a spirit or simply a flame of consciousness, that is worth preserving, worth protecting, worth carrying through the darkness toward whatever light awaits on the other side. The Egyptians gave that whisper a language. They gave it a structure. They gave it a name. They called it going forth by day, and for 3,000 years, it was enough. Let it be enough for tonight. Let the words carry you as they carried so many before you through the gates of the underworld, past the guardians and the trials and the scales, into the wide green fields where the air is sweet and the water is clear, and the people you love are waiting, smiling, reaching out their hands. And now, at the end of our journey, let us rest. You have travelled a great distance tonight. You have descended into the Pyramid of Unas and read some of the oldest religious texts in human history. You have stood in the cramped, airless corridors where artisans carved hieroglyphs by torchlight 4,000 years ago. You have followed the soul of the king as it rose through the stone, through the air, through the atmosphere, to take its place among the imperishable stars. You have heard the story of Osiris, the god who died and rose again, whose myth became the template for all who followed him into the darkness. You have watched the sun god Re battle the serpent Apophis in the deepest hour of the night, and you have seen the dawn return as it always returns, as it will always return. You have stood in the Hall of Two Truths and watched the weighing of the heart. You have seen the scale balance. You have heard the word Markeru spoken, true of voice, justified, and you have watched the justified soul step forward into a paradise that mirrors the best of everything it had known and loved. You have met Anubis and Thoth and Isis and Horus. You have learnt the names of the gates and the guardians. You have held the amulets in your hands, small and heavy with power. You have read the spells and understood, perhaps for the first time, why the ancient Egyptians believed that words could change the world. And now the journey is over. The underworld is behind you. The gates are past. The trials are done. Before you lies the field of reeds, stretching to a horizon you will never reach because there is no end to it. The water is clear, the sun is warm. The air smells of lotus blossoms and fresh bread and the faint, sweet scent of myrrh. The people you love are here. They have been waiting. They are smiling. They reach out their hands and draw you in, and the fields close around you like arms, like warmth, like the deepest and most restful sleep you have ever known. You are home. The Nile runs softly beyond the edge of your garden, its waters dark and smooth as polished stone. Somewhere in the papyrus thickets, a heron calls, its voice low and unhurried, a sound that has not changed in all the long centuries since the first scribe sharpened his first reed and began to write. The reeds bend gently in a breeze that carries the scent of lotus and warm earth, and something else, something older, something that might be the scent of eternity itself. Above you, the sky deepens from violet to indigo, to the absolute velvet black of the Egyptian night, and the stars appear one by one, then in clusters, then in rivers and torrents and floods, until the entire dome of heaven is alive with light. The Milky Way arches overhead like a pathway, and perhaps it is a pathway, the celestial road that the souls of the dead have walked since the beginning of time, their footsteps made of starlight, their destination a place that has no name because it is beyond all naming. The stars wheel overhead just as they wheeled over Egypt 4,000 years ago. The same stars, the same patterns, the same slow, patient turning of the cosmos. And somewhere far away and long ago, a scribe dips his reed pen in ink and writes the final words of a spell, his hand steady, his heart light, knowing that the words he writes will endure, will survive the collapse of kingdoms and the silence of millennia, will reach across time to find you here, in this moment, in this place, resting on the edge of sleep. The spell is for you, it has always been for you. Go forth by day, rest in peace by night, and let the light find you wherever you are, in whatever form you take, and in whatever world you wake to when the darkness passes. Sleep now, sleep deeply, sleep well. The gods are watching over you, the stars are watching over you, and the words endure. The words endure.